Okay. Welcome on this nice spring day. It's nice to have David here from over from SPIA, and he knows the rules. So he gets his 5 minutes before I see hands waving. David.
Great. It's great to be here. Thanks everyone for coming. What I thought I'd do with my 5 minutes is sort of situate this paper in the broader project which we're working on, and then just say a few things about what's motivating this particular analysis. So the broader project essentially has the following central argument, and that is the literature on U.S. state and environmental policy implementation has for 3 decades assumed the state, meaning state level, was the right level of analysis to be looking at all sorts of outcomes. And in doing so, this literature, which I've been a part of, sort of ignores some pretty fundamental things about how we're situated in this country. Everything from administrative boundaries to political boundaries to environmental problem boundaries. And it could be that how these different boundaries overlap have pretty significant implications for understanding patterns of policy outcomes and policy outputs from the government standpoint. So we generally are sort of calling this, for now at least, sort of this idea of policy geography, trying to take the role of geography seriously in implementation. I should note that there's lots of literature out there. So particularly what I'm talking about is a literature in political science predominantly, but also a little bit in economics, that looks at sort of enforcement in particular, but also permitting and other kinds of regulatory actions under federal environmental laws, which in the United States are principally carried out at the state level in terms of their day-to-day operation. So the EPA may set standards, but the lion's share of activities are handled in states across the country. They're not handled in terms of enforcement or permitting by EPA folks, either in headquarters in Washington or in their 10 regional offices. So in some respects, studies have sort of recognized the theoretical importance of these different kind of boundaries, but in terms of empirically, they've not, the sort of treatment's been sparse and pretty narrow in scope. So we think this is pretty important because really what we've learned about the role of politics, economics, task environments, things like that, has really focused on the state. And they're sort of missing what could be really interesting variation at below the state level in terms of how these overlapping boundaries shape both the incentives of regulatory officials as well as the regulated entities that are trying to comply with these various laws. So the project is really looking at 3 particular questions. So what's the role? So we're thinking about state devolution, in particular to regional offices within states, which you read about. So one of the big questions we're interested in is how this reshapes principal-agent arguments and principal-agent relationships with inside state governments. Rather than treating sort of having a single principal and single agent, now we have this really interesting and rich environment of multiple principals and multiple agents, which we want to understand. A second is this idea of whether or not this kind of policy evolution creates what are sort of thought of as being risk hotspots throughout the country. I'm very interested in how environmental policy affects vulnerable communities, particularly low-income and minority populations. And there are a lot of interesting environmental justice questions which come out of this, which have been really haven't been fully explored without taking into account this devolution idea, or this policy geography idea more specifically. And then the third question, where this paper sits, is whether or not these state devolution sort of induces coordination dilemmas, right? So what happens when you decentralize your implementation regime into regional offices and these dissect interesting problem boundaries? Call it a watershed, think of an airshed, think of other kinds of resources. This should change the fundamental calculus of regulatory officials who are trying to manage these resources. I'll say more about that in a second. So what we're doing in this project, we have some money from NSF to go out and collect a whole bunch of sort of sub-state data. Everything from administrative regions to state legislative districts to environmental boundaries. And we're going to put it all together, mostly using GIS, but also some other things, and try to understand, essentially, try to get some levers on some of these questions that I just outlined for you. So in this particular paper, it's sort of hitting on that third question, right? So we're really interested in the implications of states devolving authority to regional offices to implement the Federal Clean Water Act. And as you saw in the paper, there's quite a bit of variation in how states go about how much devolution they actually do. In some states, they don't do anything. They're essentially, everything is operated out of a central office. But in most states, there are some number of regional offices. It could be 4, it could be 5, it could be 10. I think in one state it's up to 14. Right? They essentially are sort of carving out their state into different territories And these regional offices are the sort of the locus of where decision-making is actually occurring in most respects. And it turns out that these cut across watersheds in very interesting ways. There's pretty rich variation in how this dissection occurs. There's a table in the paper that sort of describes how this goes. The 2,200 or so watersheds in the United States, about 600, only 600 are contained wholly within a single regional office. The rest are dissected by 2 regional offices, 3 regional offices, sometimes interstate. And we think this might affect how regulatory officials go about performing their job. In particular, we think it may create coordination dilemmas. So what happens when they're trying to manage a watershed and they have to worry about how they're going to allocate their effort in relation to how someone in the next region is going to allocate their effort? You might think about free riding behavior. You may think about coordination dilemmas. Lots of different ways to consider this. So in particular, we're thinking about this in terms of how this shapes the incentives of regulatory agents, right? So the field officers that are responsible for carrying out inspections, right, which is the principal way in which we try to assure compliance of federal laws. How they decide how to treat violations, things of that nature. So that's sort of the push in this particular paper. The last thing I'll note is that the paper is still under development. That should have been pretty clear to you as you were reading. We are still in the midst of major data collection, and there's a lot of analysis still to be done. That data includes getting everything from more information about these regional areas, including what they look like politically and demographically, to test the heterophily hypothesis, which is in the paper, as well as to incorporate data on watershed quality, as well as the direction of flow of all the streams in the United States. So there's information about the watersheds themselves, which we think could be important for shaping incentives, and we're in the midst of collecting that information as well. So that said, this is actually really the perfect time to talk about this paper, because it really is at an early stage. We're not fully committed to anything yet. This is really our first effort to express some of the ideas that we're thinking about and begin to think about how to shape an empirical analysis to test some of our hypotheses. So I'll stop there. I look forward to your questions and comments, and I will turn the table over to you all.
Lauren, Jessica, Ken.
So I have a question about one of your measurements. Sure. It's just a clarifying question. You're using percent watershed in the region as an indicator of degree of dissection, yes? Mm-hmm. So one question is so you sort of suggest that you're sort of surprised by the result that you get there initially with respect to compliance. And I'm wondering that given that on either end, right, there's sort of, that essentially what we would think of as the theoretical implication of dissection, which would be the same at very, very low percentages as well as very, very high percentages, it just would be in a different region. Mm-hmm. Is there a reason you would have expected that to be positive, right? So I guess I wouldn't have been super surprised by a non-monotonic relationship, because when I think about dissection, it's either it's 50-50 where it's much more in one or much more in the other, and so a very, very small, a very, very low measurement of that would suggest to me just that it was less dissected but in another region, and a very high measurement of that would be it's less dissected but in this particular region. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so let me sort of
so maybe I'm misunderstanding.
Try to address it. So our original thinking was that essentially the degree of which a watershed is dissected by one or more, or two or more, I should say, regional offices, that should sort of elevate or amplify the coordination dilemmas and might result in lower effort overall. The basic idea is if this is a shared resource and I'm being held accountable for the entirety of that watershed quality and I don't have control over it, I'm going to allocate my effort to places where I do have more say, so to speak. So that was our initial high sort of how we expected the relationship to appear empirically, right? So we were sort of assuming it was going to be, I guess, a linear kind of a thing. And sort of, just to try to give you the logic of our thinking, right? When we pushed a little bit further, we did consider the fact that it might be something like a U shape, whereas, you know, in a point where a watershed is perfectly split, or something close to that, that might be where coordination dilemmas are at their highest, right? And as you get more in control of the watershed, you exert more effort. But then the question is, why would you exert more effort in cases where you control just a little bit? And that is what's unanticipated that's what I meant, or we suggest is unanticipated in that particular relationship. That part of the U-shaped curve, if that makes sense.
Yeah, in fact, just on that, does it imply that you could be free riding off the other jurisdictional unit?
Yeah.
So if I've got 10% and Jimmy's got 90, he's doing all the lifting, and so that, the problem is you're not really measuring quality, you're measuring effort via, compliance or complaints and enforcement. But one could think about this, and I was thinking of it more in terms of cartel theory, that Saudi Arabia subsidizes everybody in OPEC because they've got the most to lose if things really screw up. And so it's a simple thing that the dominant player always subsidizes everybody else. So in small players, then the question is, can they free ride? But it doesn't seem, if you had water quality, that might be the case. But what you have seems very non-intuitive, right? On the low end. If I got 10%, but I'm really hammering these guys, like, why am I exerting so much effort over, which is what you're puzzling with, right?
I think that's right. So, that's the part of that relationship that we are still trying to figure out.
Yeah, with the upside, it should be actually linear. It should be, as you get to 100%, you should have maximum effort. Everything is the logic, right?
But so that's I think this is more just a clarification than anything else, which is to say that the thing that you're surprised at is that at the low end, that particular region is carrying out a number of compliance, not that any region in particular is carrying out many.
That's right. Yeah,
okay,
thanks for that, for clarifying it. Our frame of reference here is a particular region and how they are allocating effort, the officers are allocating effort among the watersheds that they are, where these facilities are located.
Okay, so that would be the rent. Okay, got it. Sorry, it was
No.
So it may be too early in the discussion to raise this, but the first thing I do when I see something this interesting is to ask, well, what are the implications from an administrative implementation point of view? What would we do differently? And to answer that, I realized I needed to know more about how these regions are established. And just in terms of feedback on the paper, I would encourage you to spend a little more time discussing the nature of the regions. And by that, my first question was, well, wait a minute, are these regions water regions? Or are they water, air, land? Do they have broader implications? Because if they were just water regions, you could say, well, then we ought to be redesigning these water regions to better reflect the watershed. But if they're multiple purpose, then you kind of go, well, maybe we can't do anything about water, and what we really need to do is shift our focus to how we supervise the regions.
So, as is often the case in U.S. state politics, it's all of the above.
Yeah.
Right? So there are some cases where these regions are the same across media, so air and water offices are precisely the same. There are other cases where they differ, so within states. In only one state are these water regional offices drawn in accordance with watershed boundaries. That's California, and the rest they are based mostly on political boundaries, or just some calculation is made based on either administrative flexibility, sort of rationality, or based on sort of the politics of a particular state. So it's complicated in that respect. Just to give you a little bit of the quick history, in most cases, the origin of these regional offices is statutory. They're set up by the legislature when they are organizing the state administrative agency. They don't change too often, but they do change. And we're not going to be able to do much with that in the water case, but in our air analysis, we actually have measures of these regional offices going back to the early part of the 2000s. We're collecting those data again today, and we are able to leverage where there have been changes, which will be nice for lots of empirical reasons, but we don't have that ability. So there's no single story, and that's just sort of the nature of the game, I guess.
Yeah, there's two questions.
Sure.
The first one is for the first hypothesis, you kind of find the reverse relationship. My question actually kind into Professor Richard's question is, those regional offices definitely are set up by a region. So I would expect actually, maybe because there are low inspection effort at the state level, so those regional offices are set up essentially to encourage the officials to carry out more inspection efforts. So in this situation, because you have a reverse causality there, so then the result you will show is essentially we'll see actually in those regions that have regional offices that actually there are more.
So I think it's possible that in some cases offices are designed in a way. I think what they're designed, we think at least the story is that they're designed in a way to create differential activity within the state. That could be politically determined. In some cases, they may be drawn that in a particular part of the state they want to depress inspection activity or enforcement activity more generally. But in other parts of the state, it may be that they want to amplify that activity. I think there could be both stories depending on the political nature of these, how these lines are drawn. And that part of the story is not yet in here. One of the things we hope to do moving forward is to map on local politics, if you will, onto these boundaries. That's why I mentioned the idea of incorporating state legislative district boundaries. What we hope to do is sort of find out what the local politics looks like. Why this is important, because typically in the state politics literature, what people do is they take the median ideology, or maybe something about the party, the partisan identification of the legislature, or the governor, something like that, right? And the whole idea is that, and they sort of say, that is the basis by which we're going to evaluate the intent of the state legislature. We're going to sort of measure the influence of the legislature on the administrative part of the state. It could be, though, that the local political environment is much different in some parts of the state. It looks nothing like the median, but it could be on both sides of that median. Is the point. So it's that difference, or that the difference between the local politics and state politics, which might influence the direction of inspections. Make sense? So the idea is that I don't think it's unidirectional. That could cut in both directions, towards more enforcement or less enforcement. Because that's our thought.
Let me add to that. This comes. One of my brothers spent over 30 years as an environmental engineer, head of clean water in a 4-state region in the West with EPA. And he started out, as these guys did when EPA started, he was your typical, tree-hugging, granola-eating, backpacking kind of guy. They were all zealots in EPA. And he mellowed over time. And he said, for a lot of these regions, they get what they deserve. That this is what and it's what you said, they're carved up for a reason, but I think you actually imply that maybe these people want clean water. There's a large segment out there who may not want clean water because it's costly for them to comply with this, right? And the governor, in this case, Democratic governors, who you think would be, internalizing, the governors ought to internalize these things, right? We get a weird sign there. But the heterogeneity, so it'd be interesting what I'd encourage you to do is to do some case studies of the best case and the worst case. Like Colorado is the most subdivided, I think, in 14 districts, as I recall. I think it was Colorado. And some are completely internalized. But why are, so and again, according to my brother's stories, you'd go to these local town hall meetings and you'd show them the quality of the water, like in Leadville, Colorado, and they don't care. And he's saying, this stuff's really bad for you. And they go, we grew up here, our parents grew up here, we don't care. So at some point they say, it's not worth them fighting these battles. Mm-hmm. So you wonder, so there's two parts of it. One, you might get the enforcement that the local constituents want, which is sort of what you were arguing at with environmental justice, although you were kind of putting a different spin on it. Maybe a lot of these people really don't care or don't demand that particular attribute of water. And you also treat bureaucrats as sort of economists would tend to, right? Really rational. They prefer to be leisure and be off fishing rather than really issuing compliance warrants. But it would be nice to know if there's any pattern on how these guys are selected, what their qualifications are. Are these patronage jobs? Are they merit jobs? Can we make such kind of classifications? Because I said with EPA, they were real zealots in the beginning, and they still are. People self-select to these. I don't know who self-selects to the IRS, but as taxes are coming up. But most of us self-select to stuff we like. You know, economists really like economics, and so on. So, is this the case at the state level? I think it is at the federal level with EPA. There's lots of stories about that. But so I'm just kind of, we just sort of Ken's point. We need some flesh on the bones here, I think. And if you could take a best case, worst case scenario and see, hey, why is one state so good and one state so bad by the metrics that you have?
Sure.
Is that
Yeah, it's great. So let me respond in two ways, because I think we're not quite doing case studies, we're trying to do something a little bit better than case studies, I think. So let me describe that as part of this. But the first thing to note is that the way we're thinking about regulatory officials is that they have incentives to carry out their job. Some of those are public service motivated, right? They want to do the best they can. They want to manage the resources properly they can. They want these firms to be compliant with the Clean Water Act in this particular case. But they also face a whole slew of political incentives, demands on them being made by local principals, by the local business community, which may sort of speak to what you were just mentioning about it, and that's going to vary within states, right? So they have to balance these different kinds of incentives. If they're interested in career advancement and not aggravating their superior officers, they have to be cognizant of those political demands as well. Okay? So we're trying to build into at least a theory, this idea that they have these potentially conflicting kinds of incentives. So here's what we're trying to gather on the agencies themselves. It doesn't figure it all into what we've written up so far here. So we are in the middle of collecting information on all 50 states across the Clean Water Act and the Clean Air Act, trying to understand much more about the agency design. So not just about the geography. This paper is mostly about how they've decentralized offices. We're trying to figure out two more really important, at least we think are important pieces of information. One is where decision-making authority actually rests inside agencies, right? So is it truly the case that a field officer has the full discretion to go out and decide where they're going to perform a compliance monitoring inspection, or whether or not they can respond to a violation with an enforcement order of some kind? Or does that go, how far up the chain of command does that go inside the agency? And what's really interesting, across the states, there's immense variation in what that vertical chain looks like. In some states it's 3 or 4 people, in other states it's 7 or 8 people. And we think it matters quite a bit for understanding incentives and who they're responding to, where that decision-making authority rests. So we're collecting that information. We're about halfway through that process. There's no way to get that other than calling states. That's not the kind of information you find public anywhere on websites. So we're in the middle of doing that. The other piece of it is finding out which of those, where in that level of that sort of chain of command, folks are political versus career, right? And that's sort of how we're thinking about this issue that you were just mentioning. In most cases, in most states, only the top 2 levels are political appointees. The rest are career bureaucrats who should have more feelings of public service motivation, I think, presumably. That's how we're trying to get it. Maybe case studies would help illuminate that further. So I take that point as something to consider doing. We're thinking about how to try to incorporate this variation in agency design into these kinds of analyses as a way to sort of test out how they vary across this space.
On this point, Federico? Or?
On this point, yeah. No, I wonder how, what would you expect from combining this, the information that comes from this analysis of micro foundations of distribution of political power in the offices with the larger point that you make here about the importance of drawing boundaries that are consistent with the geographical boundaries. Do you see those variables interacting in any fundamental way? Is there some sort of what do you see the result, the ultimate result as being?
So I'm not sure I completely understand your question. So you're saying, what is the implication of drawing these boundaries in a way that's not consistent?
How do you
with...
see these two results interacting? The one that has to do with the macro foundation of political power, and the one that has to do with the importance of drawing boundaries that are like constrained geographically.
Mm-hmm. So I think our basic thought is that in cases where decision-making authority rests a little bit higher, those folks should be thinking more about the big picture as opposed to their, what's happening more in a particular regional office, right? So it should contribute to solving sort of the coordination dilemmas, in sense because they have the ability to think across these dissections, right? At least that's our thought. Now, that may be conditional on who they are, what their preferences are, right? So that could actually, how that plays out with enforcement behavior may depend if they are, in a conservative area versus a more liberal area.
Yeah.
So those are the kind of things we're hoping to test out.
Right.
But that's the direction of our thinking. At least.
Right, but then, maybe I'm just misunderstanding what the result of this paper, as it is with the data that you have presented, is, which is what Ken was bringing up in his question. Like the fundamental result is that there is a correlation between enforcement and the way that these districts are drawn, whether they follow the boundaries of the watersheds, right? Is that correct? So how are the two variables, the geographical and the political, interacting?
Okay. So, yeah, I mean, maybe that we're reluctant to sort of draw out those implications yet.
Okay.
But I think,
fine.
just because this is, I try to be careful in sort of drawing large implications before having the data to support it. But I think the logic where you want to go with this, where we hope to go, is to suggest that if we were to draw boundaries differently, we may find, on average, better outcomes. Where better outcomes here could be improved compliance behavior. Ultimately, we care about the environmental outcomes, and we hope to correlate that with the environmental outcomes as well. But that's at least where we hope to go. That's what we expect, but we're not to a point where we can assert that with any level of confidence.
Yeah.
Gustavo?
So, my feeling that maybe it's interesting to use a little bit some theory on fiscal federalism or decentralization in general, because this is looking, essentially, my feeling is that it's the same kind of trade-off, So essentially, you can go to the very centralized way of allocating resources. It's more likely that you internalize all the externalities, but suddenly what you lose is like that different groups want different things, so essentially you lose some dealing with this heterogeneity, and you must be a little bit fussy with incentive at the more centralized level compared with a more decentralized level. No? So my feeling that in this trade-off, the magnitudes of the externalities are key. No? Let's put the two extreme cases. I know that you are dealing with the gray area, no? But when externalities are huge, you want the decentralized way of allocating resources. No? When externalities are almost nothing, what you want is like markets, essentially, the most possible level of decentralization. No? So essentially, my feeling is that connecting your paper with this more general literature could be useful. But again, so maybe I'm misreading the paper. No?
Yeah, no, I think that is relevant in the sense that if governments are trying to design systems, right, governance systems to manage problems, they're trying to essentially have to decide where to place authority, right? Whether it's going to be more central, whether it's going to be more decentralized, or something that might be, in the middle of that. So, I like the idea of trying to link that to the degree of the problem or the extent of the externalities, right? I think we'll be able to do that a little bit once we incorporate the data on quality of the watersheds. So I think that's what we're going to hope to do. The challenge, of course, is that these decisions to sort of how many regions to create were in most cases made, 1 or 2 or more decades ago, right? And we're only going to be observing the externality data just more today, right? So this is part of a general challenge that we face with this paper and other work is that, we're trying to study these things. We're looking at contemporary relationships, and a lot of them key moving parts happened, in a prior period of time. So that's sort of where we are. But I appreciate the suggestion and the idea of trying to link it to the externalities. Our thought is that the degree of the externalities may also influence how they're carrying out their performance today.
Yeah, I think you may have a very complicated case in which kind of the level of externality kind of influence the government decision, and then the allocation system that they pick also influence the coordinations, which are essentially externalities. No? So maybe I think that using the theory could give you some kind of idea of in which direction the effect should go, or something that could help.
Yeah, and I appreciate.
But I don't have any particular.
No, I think this is a case where theory will help more than we're not going to have a slick causal identification strategy given the nature of the data, right? So I think pushing more on theory will be critical.
Edu, Barb, Nico.
Thank you for the paper. It's a great project. I read it really fast, so I cannot comment on particular results, but I'll tell you what came to my mind when I was looking into your models, or what kind of information I was missing there. First is the order of the watershed. So are you treating just first order watersheds? Or second order, third order? You know what I mean? Because in different regions, the topography and so forth will give importance to different levels of watershed, in which the coordination may be tailored to that. So it may be that in a region it's really important to manage a sub-watershed where all the dynamics are going on, and that's the level of emphasis where one has compared to the first order watershed, which is sort of the bigger system that gives the name to that watershed. So that was not clear to me, the level of watershed order, or at least clarify that. I think that's important. Then I thought it was really nice your effort to get into the environmental justice component of it, in terms of population minorities, but I didn't see population density itself as a component of your model, and implying that larger population density will have a higher coordination effort implied to that. And that's the kind of data that you could, from what you described here, easily bring into the system to see whether it has any importance. The third one was land cover. Assuming that, for instance, watersheds that are forested may have a different level of coordination than watersheds that are agricultural or urban industrial. And that data is really good for the U.S., and available in a compatible way that I think you can bring into your systems to see whether the land cover of a given watershed has a particular role. So those are my comments in the way I sort of quickly read the model and the kinds of errors that I would expect. In terms of literature, coming from the side I'm coming, I would the kinds of problems that you described here has been quite a bit discussed and elaborated through political science on the concepts of institutional fit and institutional interplay. A literature that Warren Young has developed, and many others. And actually, we have a student from here, Graham, who did a very nice review paper on institutional fit and institutional interplay last year. So that would be a literature that, depending on the journal that you plan to submit this, people would right away think about that, right? Because it's exactly the kind of problem that you were talking about. Policy geography is discussed within those terms in that more common pool resource kind of literature. And yeah, I'll stop there.
Great, thanks for those suggestions.
Barb?
Yes. Towards the end of your paper, when you are discussing that the results did not confirm your initial hypothesis and you're trying to posit an alternative explanation, you talk about the fact that maybe some enforcement actions are symbolic, but you don't define what you mean by that. So it seems like this needs to be more further developed. I mean, what do you mean by symbolic inspection? How would you further evaluate or analyze, trying to determine what that is? And the only familiarity I have with that kind of strategy, for example, in political science, there's a literature on blame avoidance strategies. And one form of blame avoidance strategy is what they refer to as symbolic placation. So you appear that you're satisfying some kind of need. So you can claim that you are, but you're really not seriously trying to address the problem.
Right.
That's the only thing that came to my mind. So when you said that, that's the only part of literature that kind of perked up my head, but you don't develop that here. So I don't know where you're going with that, so I just wanted to suggest that you need to further develop that if you want to pursue that.
Thank you. Yeah, that's one of those parts of the paper just hasn't been fully written yet, in part because we want to do more analysis. But let me tell you what we're thinking about.
Okay.
So there's often in sort of the regulatory enforcement literature a distinction drawn between sort of symbolic and sort of, I don't know, real enforcement or stronger enforcement, where symbolic enforcement is thought about as agents going out and performing some activities without the real purpose of coming down hard on firms that they find to be in violation, right? So by symbolic, one could go out and inspect. One could learn things through an inspection. One could learn that there is a violation and then turn the other way.
But how do you document? How would you actually
this?
Operationalize trying to separate what's symbolic from what's not symbolic?
Well, this is why. So that's why we're looking at two different sets of regulatory enforcement activities, right? One are these compliance monitoring efforts. The other are how they're actually responding to violations, right? That's the second set of models looking at the set of sanctions or punitive actions taken to bring violating firms back into compliance, right? So there are two sets of activities, and what we're finding essentially is that there may be some additional activity in terms of compliance monitoring. They go out and they look, but there's evidence more consistent with shirking, if you will, or failing to solve this coordination problem when it comes to penalizing firms. And by penalizing firms, that is the way you bring them back into compliance, right? Without some sanction, at least if you believe deterrence theory, they're unlikely to bring themselves back into compliance with the law. Now, there's one more thing we can do, which we haven't done yet. It turns out within the data on the administrative data on Clean Water Act inspections, there is a way to essentially identify the stringency of the inspection itself. So inspections, right now, we are grouping them all together. It turns out in reality, they are everything from literal drive-bys. We're driving around the perimeter of this facility to see what we can see, right? To everything up to a sampling inspection where they do independent sampling of the effluent coming out of the facility, right? And there's a whole bunch of things in the middle. So I think we could sort of think hard about what a symbolic inspection may actually be more like the drive-by kind of inspection, whereas a sincere effort to get at the compliance behavior would be one of these sampling inspections. We have not leveraged those data yet, but we have the ability to do so. That's one direction.
Yeah, I think you need more clearly define what you mean by that, symbolic. And one other thing just to offer, when it was discussed earlier about the levels and how many people are involved, how do you separate when maybe somebody at one level actually doing monitoring the inspection is serious about it, right? It's not just a drive-by, but that person can't control the enforcement decision. So there's a gap between, you've got a hierarchical gap or institutional gap between the person who might actually go out and inspect, but there's a separate person who actually makes a decision about enforcement. So it gets back to the problem, what's symbolic and not. Because there can be a gap between those people who govern those two decisions. So.
Absolutely. I think that's critical. That's why we're interviewing and trying to learn about the states, how they're actually organized. Because in some cases, you do have to get approval, one, to carry out the inspection at all, but two, to respond in some way with a punitive order. Often that has to go up the chain of command. Often it has to go outside the regional office to the state. It's handled more centrally by the enforcement division within the state. So we're in the process of gathering those data, which we think that's critical to understanding the activities, the incentives at the official space.
Nico?
So thinking a little more about the empirical strategy and the choice of the dependent variable. So right now you're using several different sets of dependent variables, right? You're using the counts of violations, the discrete measure of formal versus informal non-compliance. And it sounds like there are a lot of things included in the dependent variable, right? You mentioned the effluent violations, failure to submit discharge reports, violations from previous compliance schedules. So going back to what Barbara mentioned about maybe as you go forward, trying to maybe have different models for each of those types of violations. And some types will allow you more flexibility. For example, I'm thinking of the effluent violations. Right there, you will actually, I assume you have actual discharge amounts. Is that right? Of types of effluent.
You should assume.
Okay. And I assume
sure
also,
we do, yeah.
and I assume also there's a threshold, right? So if you're over the threshold, you are in violation.
Yeah.
So maybe a continuous measure of the effluent over the threshold will allow you to capture not only violators, but also firms that are in compliance, but are very close to the threshold. So different types of dependent variables will allow you to get at different features of compliance. And I wonder if that would be useful to incorporate in the analysis as you go forward.
So thanks, Nico. So you're thinking in terms of how we're measuring non-compliance. This is an explanatory variable, right? It's a characteristic of a firm and a firm's behavior that we think is
So you're
sort of predicting whether or not government responds in some way.
for your dependent variable, you're using number counts of violations, correct?
No, it's the inspection activity of the regulatory officials.
Okay, I misunderstood.
Yeah, that's fine.
I apologize.
So that's what we're doing there. But there are, to your point though, we are aggregating activities into these two categories. And I think that makes sense to do in the case of enforcement actions because these are pretty rare events. You might be surprised how rare it is that you see an enforcement activity by a government official. So I think we have a hard time getting any leverage if we were to disaggregate that in a particular way. You can make distinctions between more informal actions and more punitive actions. Sometimes that can be informative. We don't do that here, but we will, and I'm sure in subsequent analysis.
Jim?
So David, my question is actually more just about the data, because I'm just
Sure.
still confused, as usual. So the first regression is on the number of inspections, right, in a year. So I think it sounds like you've got a panel data type setup. Like, how many years?
I think here we're using 4 years of data. I
4
think it's
years.
2010 through 2013.
So I don't know. I start off like on the first regression, the intercept is 0.81. So does that literally mean that we're talking maybe 1 to 2 inspections per year?
I don't know if I have the.
So one thing would help is,
yeah.
so as you develop the paper, is sort of developing this part. Why these dependent variables and sort of what's the distribution look like and things of that nature. But I mean, I started thinking of this just purely as a production problem of an agency, and these agencies are probably different in size. They're regulating different number of people is different, the staffing is different, the size of the area is different, and so I think it's kind of important to understand that aspect of the data before trying to get at sort of these more political or whatever questions that may affect behavior. If you just had a purely sort of production function type of approach to this, would you guess that some areas are going to have more inspections than others? It would start there. But I mean, I don't know. It just seems like to me, at least if I'm looking at this right, we've got on average 1 or 2 inspections per year, which I don't know. So the second point is on this issue of the third and fourth regressions. So now we're looking at enforcement action, but that's a result of an inspection. So, I mean, it's a dependency that depends on what you found in the inspection, right? So what if you're in an area that you've been doing a lot of inspections, they know you're going to do inspections, and so it's a clean area, and so you're going to be picking that up how? So those are the kind of things I would be asking to try to sort of better clarify exactly what the data is telling you and how you're looking at it.
Sure. And this is again the difficulty or the challenge of presenting a paper that's half written, right? So I can tell you that. I mean, your estimation of 1 or 2 inspections per year per facility is about right. and on average number of enforcement activities would be about 0.05. That's why I said it's a really rare event.
So I think that makes it a more difficult empirical question, I think. It's kind of like there's no theory here. It just seems like if you've got very few observations, you're trying to explain something, I think, with pretty small variance. Maybe that's what I'm getting at.
I mean, there is, so I gave you sort of the mean level. There is quite a bit of variance in that measure, right? Because some of these are really large facilities, they get inspected more frequently. Some of these are actually about 2/3 of these are wastewater treatment plants. They tend to get inspected less frequently. So we're trying to control for these kinds of factors in the model, as well as we have a measure of the total number of facilities in the region, which should get at some of these issues of just scale and production, as you're mentioning. But we can certainly think more about the data structure and think if we're fully capturing that.
You might even talk about the paper would be. I think it'd be helpful to me if you talk early on about what is an inspection, what goes into an inspection. It certainly must be clearly not they're going to go out there for a week and head
50
back.
different models for 50 different states, or maybe multiple models for each state for each office.
But then you got to be careful about what's going into the
That's
data.
I understand.
Does it make sense?
That's right. But I suspect that there's more of that going on than you believe.
Yeah.
That'd be my experience in state government.
So in some areas, if an inspection is taking 3 months, in another area it's taking 3 weeks, that's a very different thing.
So Jimmy, I'm curious, did you think that 1 or 2 inspections per facility per year was lower than you expected?
So maybe I'm back to understanding the data. Is it 1 or 2 inspections per year per facility or per agency?
Per region.
Per region?
No, this is per facility. Our analysis is at the facility level.
The facility being
would be a major source of a major permit holder under the Clean Water Act.
Yes, I think.
The point source, I should say, point source.
Understood it that way. I did. So.
Yeah, and just on that, I know federal agencies have to announce to the facility that they're going to come in and inspect them. So that, hey guys, we're going to come in 2 weeks and inspect your facility. So under that scenario, you can maybe do something to come into compliance faster. So it would be, I know there's 50 states, but I don't know if they all have that, or if they could just, do a sting where they come in and say, hey, we're open the doors, we're inspecting you. And I'm not sure they can. But it'd be useful to know more of that. Stefan, you were in the queue?
Yeah, so I noticed, I guess part of it is, so these major sites, you mentioned that the major ones include a whole bunch of stuff, not all of which made it into the control variables. It looks like you're looking sort of control variables, you have industrial sites and you have publicly owned treatment plants. The thing that caught my eye was actually you have these concentrated animal feeding facilities. And so I wonder whether or not there's a greater challenge in doing site investigations for some of these facilities than others. I mean, I could see if you have a factory, sort of straight out of the Lorax, chucking glop into the pond, it might be fairly easy to see if you have a bunch of animals pooping in one spot, and waste treatment plant, retention ponds and all sorts of stuff might be harder. So I wonder whether or not they're fungible in that way. I don't know how many of these there are. I mean, it may be that your control barrel also, for all intents and purposes, captured all the facilities we really care about. And somewhat related to that, I wonder if you get into the neighborhood a little bit, but do you have industry type clustering that would matter? In other words, do you find that factories are all sited around urban areas and so they're all pretty close and easy to get to, whereas these feed sites might be dispersed across a very large region that's, a single region relying on one office. So I wonder if there's any difference there that would have any impact.
Yeah, it's a great question. I don't know what proportion of the facilities are But so I don't know the answer to that. So it'd be easy to check.
I mean, there's also sort of the catch-all for other
The
facilities,
question is,
right? So.
yeah. So what is that? So for us, they are in the other categories. We're comparing publicly owned treatment works and federal facilities. You know, they're sort of in that the zero part of the variables. But it might be interesting to look at sort of these different facility characteristics. You know, the short response to that, though, is that, you know, we're interested in, so that matters to us only if it's somehow correlated with the dissection of these watersheds in some way, right? It may be, and it goes back to the point about urban versus rural, which is not accounted for here. And we could certainly, that might be a quick way to at least check some of these things, as well as the question you raised about how sort of concentrated these facilities are. I mean, it is true that in some of these regions there are a lot more facilities than others, which is why we're controlling for that. Maybe that's not fully getting at that story.
And I can see a small region with sort of a cluster of things might in some ways be easier than a region with less, but that are dispersed across the entire state of Montana.
Right. Yeah. So yeah, worth us thinking about.
Yeah, I'm wondering, it's kind of building up on the same question, because I'm wondering the type of industry that you have and how it's affecting the actual monitoring and enforcing efforts, because there are some industries that are perceived to be way more damaging than others. For instance, if you have a chemical facility, probably people is going to be more aware of the potential negative effects of that. And that's also affecting probably the political constituency. So maybe an interaction between these two, the characteristics of the people living there, their political inclinations, and the type of industry that you have. I think that's going to be having, or could be having, a strong effect on how they decide to undertake the monitoring efforts, and eventually if they decide to actually enforce actions.
Visibility of.
Yeah, so it's a good question. I mean, so the first thing to note is that these are all what are known under the Clean Water Act as major permit holders. So by definition, they are large scale. Essentially, if you're in that category, you are discharging a good deal of effluent on a daily basis. Now, within that category, there could be politically or economically important facilities, given, let's say, how many jobs they provide for a local area. Or how much revenue they're generating for local or state government. So in order to get the information that you are suggesting, what that essentially requires is having very specific sort of firm level, facility level data, which is, that might seem like the kind of thing that would be plentiful, accessible, and all, in a nice package for you. It's actually a lot more challenging to that. And this is one of the trade-offs of what happens when you study lots of facilities versus some facilities. So to do that, you have to go to separate confidential census databases to learn anything about facilities. Then you have to match that using, there essentially are no unique identifiers. So you have to do a lot of sort of hand matching to that kind of information. So it's a hard thing to do. That's not a satisfying answer, but it's the reality of working in this particular space. There's a great set of papers out there that has this kind of information, and they look at the same, 300 pulp and paper pulp and paper manufacturing establishments. They had that rich information so they can use for those things, but then they're studying one particular kind of facility, and we want to study the whole set. So it's just a trade-off that we are constantly trying to think through.
So one thing, so do you know if in your data set you have some kind of important natural disaster? Things like really happen, like they have national exposition on TV or something like that, because that could give you an interesting variation to figure out how, because that probably affect a lot the demand for inspections, no? And that you could do before and after, and maybe this could be interesting. Like something
do you
that
have anything in mind?
I don't know.
You sort of think
you
about
need the Watergate
West
of big
Virginia
things.
case we saw last Friday, the spill in West Virginia.
Yeah.
Right. That was
We could check those things. I'm not sure anything falls within our particular timeline. But yeah, so maybe those kinds of things would have a shift on the entire system. We could sort of, maybe. I'm actually, yeah.
So, sorry, since they are just kind of relatively particular events, if you can identify those, then I think it looks cheap to check before and after. And and maybe you get something interesting. Maybe you don't. It's doable.
One of the strategies we have in the back of our heads for getting at some of the causal identification is to look at changes in state legislative districts. Right? So we have a redistricting that's done after the 2010 census, so 2011, 2012 in some cases. In some cases it's still ongoing because they're in the courts. But in a lot of, not just this paper, but for others, we're thinking about leveraging those kinds of shifts. All of a sudden, if you're a regional office, in a particular case, and in the pre-period you are represented by one set of political actors, after redistricting by a different set, that should be exogenous to any things happening around water quality type issues or enforcement, I think. That may give us, at least we hope, some ability to get at some of these kinds of issues. But we're not quite there yet. We're in the process of collecting the before and after data. But I like this idea of some sort of event. It could have been an algae incident in Lake Erie in Ohio, I believe.
Yeah.
The chemical spill in West Virginia. Those kinds of things might be worth thinking through.
Yeah, what I have in mind, something like those events happens. Some politicians at the state level says, "Oh, I don't want one of those in my jurisdiction." So suddenly there is some kind of pressure to start doing more inspections and check. No?
Yeah.
And that could
one would think. I'm actually quite skeptical that agencies respond that way, but because they are hamstrung by lots of other kinds of constraints, mostly resource constraints, they're much more programmatic in their approach to these things. But perhaps, I think it's worth checking, and it'd be easy enough to do. So I like that check.
As a complement to that, I think it'd be useful to go back before your data starts. Just go back the past 10 years and look at the budgets of these agencies. Because usually there's a lot of stasis. But if there isn't, that could, imply something like Gustavo said, that, whoa, somebody came in and there was something that got everyone's attention, and now we got to devote X amount of our resources, more than we had thought. So some controls before your period, just to condition, and then during your period, budgets, you would think, should make a difference, if to the extent you're resource constrained, whether you go in and check the facility or just do a drive-by, depends. So I think that would be an easy thing to get budget data on, I think. But maybe not.
Yeah, welcome to my life. Easy. These are the things you think would be easy. I challenge all of you to go home and see if you can find state environmental budget data. The Environmental Council of the
There's
state.
a price at which we could.
Yeah, but it's actually quite a challenging endeavor. The Environmental Council of the States, which is a DC organization that represents state environmental agencies across the country, has periodically surveyed states on this. The most recent survey, I think, was 2008. It's no longer that periodic. They're just not doing it anymore. And you would think those data would be sort of something you could do easily, but the challenge is that each state calls things different things. You actually have to go through with a pretty fine-tooth comb to understand what counts and what doesn't count. So I think you're exactly right. The challenge is actually getting those kinds of things. I'd love to know FTE, how many personnel are associated with these things by region. But we have what we have to some degree.
Okay, well, last word is to the speaker.
Well, thanks everyone for your time and suggestions. As I noted at the top, this paper is still very much in the making. So we'll certainly your comments really pay dividends to us as we continue on. So thank you.
Okay, thank you.